This is Pennsylvania Inside Out Issues on WPSU TV. Focusing on family and education, here's tonight's host, Dr. Barbara Farmer.
Good evening. When you and I were children, we probably hated homework. Now we're hearing from more and more parents who feel the same way. Tonight on Pennsylvania Inside Out, my guest and I will be discussing the state of homework in our schools today. How much is too much, and how close to that level are we today? And what roles should parents and family play when considering a child's homework? In the interest of full disclosure, I do want to let you know that when I'm not hosting Pennsylvania Inside Out, I am the principal of two elementary schools in Centre County, Lamont and Hauserville. Joining the discussion tonight is Penn State Professor of Education, Dr. Gerald LeTendre, who has studied homework and homework trends around the world. Jerry, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
As we get started on this topic tonight, it has implications in terms of achievement, performance, family input, frustration, stress, and all those kinds of things. So share with us what you're finding when you compare what we do in the United States with, let's say, Japan.
Okay. Japan's a good place to start out with because while we've been trying to ramp up homework in the U.S. over the last 10 years, they've been trying to ramp down.
Wow.
And when I was in Japan about 10 years ago, going into schools and doing research, I ran into a number of elementary schools that actually had no homework policies for the entire elementary school. And a lot of Americans are very surprised about that because they think of Japan as this high stress, high pressure studying place, and that's precisely why they've been doing this. They're worried. Many principals, particularly elementary schools, are worried that their kids are too stressed out. And so there's been a backlash against homework, and I think you're seeing a very similar thing here.
Now, help me with that, because that sort of debunks the myth of what we've always believed about Japan and all the pressure and the stress and that sort of thing. So when they're saying no homework, help me with that. Does that then mean if they're not having homework, is their school day longer? Are they going to school 6 or 7 days a week? What are they doing to compensate for taking homework out? Well,
much of what compensates in the system there are the cram schools, the school outside the schools. So when you get into homework, it sounds like a very simple topic, we're all familiar with it, but as you start to peel back the layers, it is a very complicated thing, as Lynn Corno, who's one of the experts, has said. And so in Japan, you've got a system that's been driven by these very tight entrance exams, you've got chain cram schools all over the nation, and that participation is pushed downward into the elementary school. It used to be a kind of middle school and high school phenomena. So I think it's been a reaction against that. At the same time, though, on this side of the Pacific, you've had administrations ever since Ronald Reagan that have been promoting the idea that American students need to study more, need to do more. And when we did the analysis for our book, National Differences, Global Similarities, with 1995 data, lo and behold, we found that these have had an effect, and American kids are at about the international mean with regards to homework. In fact, we've outpaced some countries like Japan in the 4th grade, but we're still behind some other countries. I believe Romania tops the rankings.
Okay. Now help me, because I want to make sure that our guests who are watching the show tonight understand that it isn't just a deletion of homework from the Japanese setting, and that's it. They have another variable, a couple of other components that we don't have. Talk about the chain schools, I believe you said?
The chain schools. Well, I think the first thing I'd want to talk about are the entrance examination tests. And many people have said this drives what goes on in Japan. You have to take a test to get into high school. High schools are free and open to all in Japan, but how high you score depends on where you go.
Okay.
So if you don't score very high, you're going to be relegated to some of the lower status high schools. So to prepare for that, children will go to these cram schools. And of course, then once they're in school, they're going to go to cram school again if they want to get into a good college.
Okay.
Now, that seems very different from our system, but think about what goes on here in Pennsylvania with the PSSAs.
Okay.
Think about No Child Left Behind.
Oh, we must.
We must. And what has happened here in the U.S., or what I see happening, is although we don't have formal entrance examinations like the Japanese, we have come to place more and more emphasis on these tests.
Correct.
And I think this may be one of the factors that's driving the amount of homework up, particularly at the lower grades. And of course, this is where, at least in the interviews I've done, where parents are really up in arms.
Okay, but then if we, with what you just shared, then for, let's say, and we'll stay with the Japanese, the pressure is on the front end with the entrance exam and determining what level school you would be able to allow to be, be a part of. And in the United States, everybody walks through the door, same time, no requirements. Just be a person of the right age, and we let you in. So help us with that piece too.
Well, that's the Japanese system up until 9th grade. Their high schools start in 9th grade. So K through 8th grade, very much similar to the United States in terms of those requirements. Then at high school, you take a test. Now you can still go on to high school, but it's going to place you either in a high track academic, a middle track, a VOTEC. So it's similar to the kind of lanes we have here. Local high schools, you're going to have your AP classes, you're going to have your VOTEC. There they do it by having different sets of high schools and by setting up a formal test.
Okay. Now, I guess because I'm in public school administration, I want to sort of make sure I cover both sides of this fence. Because when you say that it determines the entrance exam at high school level, determines the particular school that you go into, then there's a stratification of schools.
Oh, there sure is.
The potential for the types of teachers and the quality of the teachers, let's say, because we're going to make the assumption, and you help me with this, that if you have that stratification, then your better teachers are going to be at the higher level schools, okay? All right, so that means the lower level students, who to me would certainly need even higher quality teachers than some of the other kids, because they're already coming with an advantage in terms of achievement and performance. So what we do here is we just bring them all into one school, because then there's a stigma that's going to be attached to you if you know that, oh, I go to school A, but he goes to school C, and school C is much better. So when I tell you I go to A, you know something about me immediately. Okay, so here we don't do that. So if you say I go to school C, everybody goes to school C. Okay, let's go back to the homework piece, because that's what we're dealing with this evening. But I think it's important that we make that clear so people don't decide, okay, we need to change things immediately here.
Yes, let's not copy what the Japanese do.
Okay, all right, I like that. Okay, in terms of homework having an impact either on achievement or performance or testing, talk to us about that in terms of the two systems.
Sure, and I want to emphasize again, our book is looking at what nations can do.
Okay.
And oftentimes people will call me up because I'm on the web at Penn State, and they'll ask me questions, and they want to know, like, what homework should my child be doing, or what should my school be doing? I said, well, if you were a country,
some days we feel like that,
right,
but okay.
Right. But if you're Mexico or Guatemala, then I'm very well equipped to tell you what's going to work. But I'm not. Our research really wasn't about what can an individual teacher or school do? So I want to make that clear. Now, I've read the research, and I can certainly tell you what the best people have to say. But what our research was looking at is, what can countries do? We hear a lot about America falling behind. Ever since A Nation at Risk was published in 1983, there's been this idea of crisis. Okay? And in our book, what we show is, well, there are certainly some areas where we have problems, but in many other areas, the United States doesn't look that different from other countries. And what we found that was very surprising with homework was that when you look at nations, and you look at just how much homework kids are getting, and you look at how well they're doing on tests, you don't see a positive correlation. In fact, most of the correlations were negative. The countries where kids are getting lots and lots of homework are the countries that were not doing very well on these international tests.
Okay, let's go back to this correlation piece here. Break that down.
Sure.
Break that down so everybody watching gets a good insight into what you're saying, because that's important.
You got these fourth graders, and on average in the nation, let's say they're getting 30 or 40 minutes of homework a night. You've got another system, like Japan, let's say, where they're getting 10. But the country that's got 30 or 40 minutes of homework isn't scoring higher than Japan, scoring lower. And that puzzles most people. They say, well, if they're doing more homework, they should be doing better, right?
We've lived with that assumption for a long time.
We've lived with that assumption. Well, think about two things. The quality of the educational system,
Okay.
and particularly the quality of the teachers.
Okay.
And who, if you're a teacher, do you usually give homework to? So the two things that we found or that we're seeing is that in systems where you have lower quality, where you have less trained teachers, or maybe you have teachers that are under really severe working conditions, homework becomes a remedial task. It's a kind of make-up thing to make up for the fact that the system itself isn't that good. On the other hand, the other thing I think that probably drives this is that teachers do tend to give homework to students they think need some help.
Right.
So it isn't surprising then, if you step back and think about it, that on a national level, the more homework that's going out probably is not going to be correlated with high achievement.
Okay, now several things come to mind as you share all of that information. Okay, let me see if I can get them straight here. One of them is quality of teachers. That takes us back to institutions where teachers are prepared. So the suggestion could be that in maybe Japan, and we don't want to ride the Japanese train, but that's one that we are always comparing ourselves with. They seem to be the standards, so that's why we'll stay with that. So if we're talking about quality of teachers, then we're talking about teacher preparation universities, and then we're talking about school systems in terms of the kind of professional development that they bring about for teachers to improve.
Teachers' working environment,
Bingo, and teachers' working environment. Then it also, as I listen to you, when you talk about nations, then let's go back to the federal government, because that's where the mandates come from. And if we look at No Child Left Behind, that's an unfunded mandate. And it's being sent to all the schools, and in some counties or states, the amount of financial aid or assistance or the budget of certain districts don't compare to some other areas. And they're being asked to do the same thing with a tiny budget, let's say, as a school system that has a mega budget.
Sure.
So that's another piece of this puzzle. Okay. Then another piece as I listened to you that came to mind is the rigidity of parenting in terms of making sure your child has all kinds of experiences, opportunities, books in the home, all of those kinds of things where preparation starts there. So when a kid comes to school, they are already a step or two ahead because they've had that kind of home type of influence. So work with those three areas for me and show how maybe our nation can do better.
Well, it's always tricky when people say, how can our nation do better? I guess the question I'd like to reframe that is, do we want to be like the Japanese?
Good question. And I want to, okay.
And
I like that.
My answer to that is, no, we're not the Japanese. We're Americans, and we have unique values. And the thing we try to point out in our book is that at the same time that many American leaders were pushing for standards, unfunded mandates to drive up achievement and through a backdoor drive up homework, the Japanese were saying, we want to be more like the Americans. Japanese educators that I talked with talk about the creativity, talk about the independence and individuality of American teachers. So, for those of us who've had the luxury, had the good fortune to go to these other countries, it's a little odd. It seems like the nations are chasing each other on this merry-go-round. One wants the higher standards, one wants more of the creativity. But to go back to your point about teachers and teachers' lives, I think from what I've seen, the work I've done, is that this is a big area, and this maybe is an area where we as a nation, the United States, could think about making some changes that might have some real benefit. When I look and compare the U.S. and Japan, American teachers are scheduled for more periods per week than their Japanese counterparts.
Okay, can you kind of...
So, in other words, they're on in front of the classroom, doing their thing, with fewer break periods, fewer prep times than their Japanese counterparts. Also, the Japanese have a very strong system of professional development where teachers study about the curriculum. And I think going back to your earlier point about schools and the different levels, one of the things that I've always admired, and maybe is one of the things we can learn from the Japanese, is that they don't hire teachers school by school. They hire by district, and then it's the district that assigns where the teachers go. So for example, here in State College, you would not be hiring your own teachers at Lamont. The district hires them. And what that allows them to do, though it has some drawbacks, it allows them to make sure that the best teachers don't all clump up in one school. And that's how they partly get around this. Now, that means that as a teacher, if you live in Boalsburg, you might be assigned to teach in Hauserville or Lamont, and you have no control over that. You get rotated about every 3 to 5 years. So I think that allows them as a nation then in one way to even that out.
Okay. We want to remind you that you're watching Pennsylvania Inside Out Issues on WPSU. I'm Barbara Farmer. Tonight's topic, homework. Our guest is Penn State Professor of Education, Dr. Gerald LeTendre. Now, you just said something interesting when you talked about potentially a suggestion for our nation in the United States in terms of how teachers are hired. Now, Jerry, you need to know that I tell people all the time that the teachers in both my buildings are the best in town, so I've got all the good ones. But when you suggest that the district would be the hiring body and then place the teachers in the schools, okay, what happens to what we consider to be climate and all those kinds of things? Right. But before we get on to that and start writing that, back to the homework piece. I think it's Cooper out of Duke.
Harris Cooper.
Harris Cooper, who talks about the 10-minute rule. Talk to us about that for a second.
Sure. There's some very good research on homework. And on the individual level, Harris Cooper is probably the most respected scholar on that.
Okay.
Now, what he's found is that in general, as a good rule of thumb, kids should not have more than 10 minutes of homework per night per grade. So a first grader, 10 minutes max. A fifth grader, 15 minutes max.
Okay.
But if you read the research and if you read what, say, the Brown Center has put out, you'll see that along with that rule of thumb, there's research that indicates that homework becomes more effective as the child gets older. Okay. So the studies at the high school level show pretty strong correlations between doing homework and doing better on tests.
Okay.
At middle school, so-so. At elementary school, there's real risks for assigning too much and getting a negative reaction. On top of that, I'd like to add one thing people, don't think about is that my kid's 10 minutes of homework, maybe not your kid's 10 minutes of homework. Particularly if you have a child that's got a learning disability.
Okay.
Or has, particular skills or issues. That 10 minutes of homework could turn out to be a lot longer.
Okay.
And from the interviews I did with parents here in Huntington County, I think this is where parents really get upset and really feel a stress because I think the teachers see them as giving fairly even amounts of homework, but for the individual child, that turns out to be something yet different again. And when you look into this research, and I think Harris Cooper is really, top notch.
Right. Okay, now, as I hear you talk about the 10-minute rule, and those children, let's say, with learning disabilities. One of the things that I'm real pleased with in the situation where I am, we use the 10-minute rule. We do use Cooper's presumption that is a good thing. But we also make accommodations for learning, children with learning disabilities and that sort of thing. But one of the other pieces, too, that we find with homework is that parents are also feeling that they are given homework. When the kid has homework, the parent has homework, because it just changes the whole climate of the home in the evening time. So as we look at that, then give us a couple of things that you would suggest that parents do to help their children with the 10-minute rule, because we do abide by that. So give us a couple of things that would be helpful to parents in terms of that homework piece.
Well, I think, as you know, as an administrator, the most important thing is communicating with the teacher. Instead of building up resentment, if you're a parent and you feel that your teachers are sending them too many worksheets that don't help your child, you need to talk to the teacher.
Very good starting point, yes.
And this is actually with my son what we did, and the teachers responded so well. And I think it's making that step to open that line of communication.
Absolutely.
And then sitting down and talking with the teacher, once you get that groundwork of communication, then both you and the teacher, as a parent, you and the teacher can talk about, well, what kinds of homework or what specific areas does my child need to drill on?
Okay.
Because again, when we look cross-nationally, when you talk about what kind of homework teachers give around the world, textbook problems and worksheets.
Okay.
So that's a kind of, for lack of a better word, a sort of shotgun approach.
Okay.
It's like saying, everybody's the same. Here it is, you all do it. Instead of thinking about, well, maybe, Johnny needs work on division, and Susie needs work on number placement.
Okay.
And I think that also, from what I've heard back from parents, is real key. When they see that the homework that's coming home is really tailored to where the child's needs, there's a lot more motivation to help with it and to be supportive of it. But if they just see it as yet another worksheet and maybe the teacher doesn't correct it,
we're talking about attitude and commitment and those kinds of things. Well, I'm certainly delighted that we've had a chance to talk about homework tonight because it's a major topic for us on a daily basis sometimes.
I'm sure it is.
And that's going to wrap things up for this edition of Pennsylvania Out Issues. We've always invite your response to our programs, and you can reach us via email to painsideout@psu.edu or through the U.S. Mail at 120 Outreach Building, University Park, PA 16802. Thanks to our guest tonight, Penn State Professor of Education, Dr. Gerald LeTendre, and thank you for joining us. I'm Barbara Farmer. For all of us here at WPSU, good night.
A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.